There's an exercise I often do with my first-year students. I have them research mainstream economic publications from the 16th to the 21st century, trying to find any mention of basic sustainability principles. And each year, the students come back stunned by how this period gave no priority to even the most obvious regenerative science, let alone anything related to public health. Such things were considered external to this contrived competitive game they called business.
Here you had an entire global civilization powering itself through the mechanism of consuming. That's literally what drove their economy, as absurd as that sounds. And the more people bought and consumed, the more demand for jobs, hence more circulating purchasing power to, again, be spent on consuming. Endlessly and viciously repeating. That was the economic system back then. And to think any part of that would be workable in the long run on a finite planet is pure lunacy.
To make matters worse, the system was rooted in strategic human exploitation, which structurally ensured large wealth and power differences between groups. And the long-term cultural result was very poor social integrity. Racism, xenophobia, sexism, and other forms of bigotry were an inevitable side effect of this kind of social system, ultimately rooted in class stratification, otherwise known as socioeconomic inequality. And when you put it all together, you realize a deep social pathology. A pathology that not only severely limited human potential, actually bringing out the worst of our biological and social nature, but one that was blindly pushing civilization toward oblivion due to accelerating ecological decline and systemic human conflict.
By the time we reach the 21st century, the consequences of all this weren't subtle. We're talking massive global inequity and poverty, relentless worldwide conflict, endless power abuses and systematic oppression, not to mention the near irreversible decline of all life support systems. And while it seems obvious to us today, you have to understand the kind of indoctrination that occurred back then. The culture was so conditioned by the dominant worldview, they just couldn't recognize the flaws inherent to the structure of their society. So by force of this, they engaged in very superficial activism, centered around political institutions that really were just a parody of themselves.
Attempts at social change were deeply fragmented in focus because people's understanding of cause and effect was so shallow. So the whole thing just became a spectacle, an endless blame game between groups. Their so-called democratic process centered not on actual policy, but around these political institutions that seemed to vaguely represent such policy. A true democracy, as we now know, allows for public consensus on actual issues, not the appointment of representatives to make those decisions for them. That's not really democracy at all. That's simply a watered-down version of authoritarianism, voting for kings and queens.
And to add insult to injury, because society was rooted in this business system of property and trade, everything was for sale. People loved to argue about moral lines and ethics, but the fact was, politicians, and hence policy, was just another commodity to be bought and sold. So inevitably, those who did end up with true social power were the ones with the most wealth. That wasn't a corruption, that was simply the nature of the system. And needless to say, this business power subculture was certainly the least likely to want to change the very system that had so disproportionately rewarded them.
And as science and technology increased efficiency, creating higher material standards of living in general, the lack of human rights progress and the anti-democratic nature of society became increasingly masked. People's dignity and integrity were bought off by gadgets and toys and addictions, feeding a materialist fetish that so distracted the minds of many.
And I often ponder all this, trying to put myself in the shoes of the average person back then, especially in the more affluent and highly unequal regions, such as the United States of America. And it really makes me shudder. People stuck in traffic, piling into these office prisons to push paper around, engaging meaningless occupations that wasted far more energy and wealth than they created, so they can continue buying these things they don't need, elevating their artificial status and so on. It's like a bad horror movie.